The Dakota winter of 1897 gripped the land with unforgiving ferocity, a stark, white canvas painted with the biting winds of hardship. For weeks, snow fell like a relentless curse, burying the world under a thick blanket of ice, a season so brutal, it etched itself into the memory of every soul who dared to call this land home. It was in the heart of this frozen despair that Thomas Whitman, a farmer weathered by the relentless trials of life, found himself facing a task unlike any he had ever known in his 43 years. He was a man forged from the very soil he tilled, his life intertwined with the stubborn prairie land his father had claimed before him. The land offered promise, yielding bounty when the rains were kind, but kindness had been a stranger in recent years. The spring had stolen his beloved Martha, leaving a gaping hole in his life, echoing with debts that multiplied like shadows in the night. The bank had seized his livestock, and the farm, his legacy, teetered on the precipice of loss. So, when Dr. Henderson, his face etched with worry, approached him on that bleak February morning with a proposition as unusual as it was unsettling, Thomas found himself listening, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. "Thomas," the old doctor began, his voice heavy with concern, adjusting his spectacles as they stood in the warmth of the mercantile store, "this isn't the sort of work you're accustomed to, I know. But I find myself in a difficult situation, and you're one of the few men I trust with something this delicate." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Thomas shifted his weight, his worn boots scuffing against the wooden floor, waiting for the doctor to continue, sensing the unusualness and the disquiet growing inside of him. "Yesterday, a traveling family came through town. They found a young woman collapsed on the road, about 10 miles south of here. When they brought her to me," Dr. Henderson paused, his gaze clouded with unspoken words. "Well, she appeared to have passed on. No pulse, no breath, cold as the winter itself." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a gesture of deep distress. "The family couldn't stay. They had their own burdens and a long journey ahead. They left a few coins for her burial, but the ground's too frozen for old man Hemmings. His arthritis has him laid up something fierce." Understanding dawned on Thomas, the purpose of the doctor's visit crystal clear. His own strength, honed by years of wrestling with the unforgiving earth, was his only qualification. Still, something about the situation felt amiss, a disharmony that resonated within him. "Doc," he said slowly, his voice laced with doubt, "if she's been gone since yesterday, why not wait for the ground to soften come spring?" Dr. Henderson looked troubled, his brow furrowed with concern. "That's just it, Thomas. Something doesn't feel right. The family that brought her seemed nervous, eager to be gone. And the girl herself, she doesn't look like someone who died of natural causes. No signs of illness or injury. Just still." Thomas studied the doctor's face, etched with years of wisdom and compassion. Doc Henderson had delivered life and tended to death in this county for over 20 years. If something felt wrong to him, it probably was. "I'll need the work," Thomas conceded quietly, his voice barely a whisper. The pay would ease his burden, and he knew he could manage the digging better than most in this weather. "I thought you might," Dr. Henderson said, relief flooding his features. "But Thomas, if anything seems unusual, anything at all, you come find me right away. Promise me that." Thomas nodded, making the promise, yet unsure what could be more unusual than the burial of a stranger in the dead of winter. The doctor led him to a small room behind his office, where the young woman lay on a simple wooden table, covered by a clean white sheet. As Dr. Henderson pulled back the cloth, Thomas drew in a sharp breath, the air catching in his throat. She was beautiful, her beauty woven with a serenity that stirred something deep within him, a longing for a poetry he had never learned to write. Golden hair spilled across the pillow like spun wheat, and her face held an expression almost too peaceful for someone who had perished on a frozen road. Her skin, though pale, possessed a luminescence, a quality that defied explanation. She appeared more like someone lost in a profound slumber than someone who had crossed the veil. "How old would you say she is?" Thomas asked, his voice hushed with awe. "Hard to tell. Maybe 25, maybe 30. No identification, no belongings, except the clothes she was wearing," Dr. Henderson replied, covering her once more with the sheet. "The family said they didn't know her name." Thomas spent the remainder of the morning preparing for the burial. He chose a quiet spot in the small cemetery outside town, beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree that would offer shade when warmer days returned. The ground was unforgiving, locked in winter's icy grip. Yet, Thomas had learned patience from years of coaxing life from the unyielding earth. He built a small fire nearby, working slowly, allowing the heat to soften the frozen soil inch by laborious inch. By late afternoon, he had managed to dig down about 2 feet. It was arduous work, his hands numb despite the thick gloves he wore. The snow continued to fall, and the short winter day began to fade into twilight. Thomas returned to Dr. Henderson's office to collect the young woman. Together, they carefully wrapped her in a simple pine coffin that the doctor had purchased from the local carpenter. As they carried her through the quiet streets, Thomas found his thoughts drifting to his Martha, to the stark contrast between this burial and the agonizing day he had laid his wife to rest. At the gravesite, Thomas gently lowered the coffin into the partially dug grave. It would suffice for now. He would finish the digging in the morning and complete the burial properly. Yet, something compelled him to pause before shoveling the first load of earth. Perhaps it was the flickering lamplight dancing across the coffin lid, or the strange unease that had followed him all day, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Whatever the reason, Thomas found himself kneeling beside the grave, carefully opening the coffin one last time. The young woman lay as they had placed her, hands folded peacefully across her chest. But as Thomas leaned closer, a gasp escaped his lips. Was it a trick of the light, or did her skin possess a hint of color it had lacked that morning? He drew nearer, his heart pounding in his chest, and then he saw it. The faintest tremor beneath her eyelids, as if she were caught in the throes of a dream. Thomas stared in disbelief, scarcely daring to breathe. Then, as he watched, her eyes slowly opened. They were the most beautiful blue he had ever seen, and they looked directly at him, filled with a mixture of confusion and gratitude that sent a jolt through his very being. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the frigid air. "Where am I?" Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind reeling. "You're safe," he said gently, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You're in Millbrook. Do you remember what happened?" She tried to sit up, and Thomas quickly assisted her, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders. She shivered, a sign of life that brought him immeasurable relief. "I remember falling," she said slowly, her voice halting. "The cold. Someone saying I was," she hesitated, her eyes widening in disbelief. "But that's not possible, is it?" She looked around at the cemetery, at the open grave, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh my goodness. Were you about to bury me?" Thomas finished quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Though I have to say, I'm mighty glad you decided to wake up first." Despite her ordeal, a smile touched her lips, a smile that seemed to radiate warmth in the biting winter air. "I'm Elizabeth," she said. "Elizabeth Carson. I don't suppose you know how I ended up here?" Thomas helped her to her feet, noting that she seemed steady enough, though still disoriented. "A traveling family brought you to our doctor yesterday. They said they found you on the road. Everyone thought you had," he paused, uncertain how to phrase it delicately. "Died," Elizabeth finished simply. "I remember feeling so cold, so tired. I must have fallen asleep in the snow." She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with wonder. "You saved my life. If you had buried me without looking," the thought sent a chill through Thomas that transcended the winter's cold. "Don't think about that," he said firmly. "What matters is you're alive and safe." They walked slowly back toward town, Thomas carrying his lantern, Elizabeth wrapped in his coat. Along the way, she shared what she could recall. She had been traveling alone to meet a distant relative in the next territory when her horse had thrown her during a sudden blizzard. She must have wandered in the snow for hours before collapsing. "I have nowhere to go now," she admitted as they reached the edge of Millbrook. "No horse, no supplies, and my relative is probably wondering what became of me." Before he could fully consider the implications, Thomas found himself extending an offer. "You could stay at my place until you regain your strength and determine your next steps. It's not much, but it's warm, and I could use the company." Elizabeth stopped walking, her gaze fixed on him in surprise. "You don't even know me. For all you know, I could be anything, a decent person who's had some bad luck," Thomas interrupted gently. "Same as most of us, I reckon." In the days that followed, Elizabeth proved to be precisely that. She was intelligent, kind, and possessed a remarkable ability to bring light into Thomas's quiet farmhouse, a warmth he hadn't felt since Martha's passing. Despite his protests, she insisted on helping with the cooking and cleaning. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories of their lives. Elizabeth had been a teacher before embarking on her journey west. She possessed a love for books and learning, and a gift for explaining complex ideas with remarkable clarity. Thomas found himself confiding in her, sharing his struggles with the farm, his loneliness since Martha's death, and his fears about losing everything he had worked for, secrets he had kept buried within himself for so long. "You know," Elizabeth said one evening as they watched the snow fall outside the kitchen window, her voice soft and thoughtful. "I've been reflecting on what happened, on how I ended up in that grave." Thomas looked up from his coffee, his brow furrowed with curiosity. "What about it? I believe maybe it was meant to happen exactly the way it did. Not the almost dying part, of course, but finding my way here to you." She smiled, that warming smile of hers. "I believe sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best ones." As winter reluctantly relinquished its grip to spring, Thomas and Elizabeth discovered a love they had not sought but desperately needed. She helped him cultivate new farming techniques, breathing life back into his weary land. He gave her the stability and partnership she had always yearned for, a haven she thought she would never find. On a warm April morning, as they worked together in the garden behind his farmhouse, Thomas looked up to see Elizabeth laughing at the antics of one of his chickens. The sight filled him with a contentment he thought he had lost forever. "Elizabeth," he said, setting down his hoe, "I have something to ask you." She turned to him, her hands smudged with dirt, her eyes radiant with joy. "What is it, Thomas? Would you consider staying here permanently? Not just as someone I'm helping out, but as my wife." Elizabeth's smile outshone the spring sunshine. "Thomas Whitman," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I thought you'd never ask." They were married that June in the little church where Thomas had once bid farewell to Martha. The same cemetery where he had almost buried Elizabeth now bloomed with flowers they had planted together, the oak tree providing shade for their wedding reception. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the day he met his wife, he would always pause, a thoughtful look gracing his features. "I was hired to bury her," he would say, watching Elizabeth tend to their children in the garden they had cultivated together. "But she had other plans entirely. Best thing that ever happened to me was taking a job I never wanted to do." Elizabeth would smile, adding, "Sometimes life has to stop completely before it can begin again in ways we never imagined." Their farmhouse became known throughout the county as a sanctuary, a place where travelers could find a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Thomas and Elizabeth never turned anyone away, remembering the sting of needing the kindness of strangers. The farm prospered under their shared care, and they raised 4 children, instilling in them the understanding that the most precious gifts in life often arrive disguised as the most terrifying moments. And on quiet winter evenings, as the snow fell thick and peaceful outside their windows, Thomas and Elizabeth would sit by the fire, marveling at the mysterious ways love finds us when we dare to keep our hearts open, even in the darkest of times.